Today we're going to talk a little bit about the skills for the American History Advanced Placement exam, and I'm going to do my best to review these with you and provide examples. My goal is to make this video about 10 minutes so you can quickly come back and review it as needed. So I'm not going to be reading off these PowerPoints to you. I'm just going to be talking about what you are looking at and seeing. So here are the skills. This is from AP Central. These are the skills for the American History exam. Some of these skills you're going to see more on the writing tasks, and overall you'll see all the skills, just about all the skills touched upon in the multiple choice exam. However, you will see continuity and change, periodization, comparison, contextualization, arguing, using evidence, interpretation, synthesis. You're going to see those a little more strongly tested on the writing assignments, such as the long essay, the DBQ, and the short answers. So let's go into a little more detail about each of these skills. And again, I'm just going to do my best to explain these to you in ways that you can understand them a little better, because the language on AP Central, sometimes it's a little bit daunting. So the first thing we have here is causation. This is a pretty easy skill. Most people understand that this is asking you to talk about why something happened and what the effects were. For instance, you might be asked about causes of tension in the United States between the North and the South before the Civil War, and you may be asked to talk about some of those effects. So that is a skill that most of us do very well with, and we've been doing a long time in history. So let's move on quickly to continuity and change. This is a skill that's a little more difficult for students to wrap their heads around. And it does rely heavily on historical themes. It does connect to that. And I have listed these historical themes right here. And I have on a separate video a deeper discussion of the themes. I'm not going to go into each one of these today and in detail. These are our themes here, starting with American and national identity and going through America and the world. But I am going to talk a little bit about what it means as far as continuity and change and what we can take from that. So let me first talk about themes a little bit. We normally talk about themes when we take literature classes and we talk about what is the lesson or theme of a book. Say, for instance, The Scarlet Letter. You know, we have a big lesson about taking revenge. And many authors write about this same theme, and it can be authors from the past, and it can be authors from the present time who still write about the issues of revenge and what happens to you when you take that path. Moby Dick is another novel that explores the issue of revenge. So like I say, these are themes that you can apply to the study of history, and that you can make sense of history with. You can say, okay, well, you know, this great migration is within the theme of migration and settlement. And then you have other times in history where you have people migrating to the west, for instance. And then you have other times when you have people migrating to the cities. And so you could say all the issues with people migrating, there are some things in common that we can talk about regarding those themes. So that's what historians do sometimes, is we make sense of what's going on in history by putting it in a thematic category and finding out what's similar and what's different. So let's look at a little bit of an example. This is an example I got off AP Central. This is not mine. I did not write this. I'm not going to take any credit for it. You can visit this website here at the bottom of the PowerPoint and look at it for yourself and see that I copied it and it's not mine. So this person has provided us a really good example of continuity and change example. And I'm going to spend a little time on this because this is a difficult skill. So here's our question up here. We see the question at the top, right here. Analyze cultural, economic, political impact of Islam. This one comes from World History. One of the following regions, we have our time frame, 1000 to 1750 CE, Western Africa, Southern Asia, or Europe. Okay, and then when we remember to talk about continuity and change, we're talking about continuity is one of those words that means what doesn't change. What stayed the same as these areas met Islamic culture? And so there is a short paragraph here about that, okay, about change and continuity, okay. So the nature of change between Muslims and people of other religions, we got changes with culture, economics, politics over the time period, okay. And then the person talks a little bit about here the ripple effects of these changes. Repeated interactions caused changes in language, food, gender roles, social standing of different professions, ethnic groups, attitudes toward other belief systems. And then below here, the person continues on and talks about the fact that despite the changes, some things remain the same. Some parts of people's lives remain the same despite the interactions with the Muslims. And so when you talk about continuity and change, you would talk about what's similar, what's the same, what doesn't change, and actually what does change, what's different. So try to wrap your head around those two topics when you begin to think about it. Here's another great source I found online. You see the website there. I just basically dragged and dropped this particular source. This is a great example of how to use continuity and change on some of the different big topics in American history. And you can see how the person uses just sentences. Life in the colonies changed after the Declaration of Independence. But some things stayed the same. Women and American Indians and African Americans didn't see a lot of change in their life. And you can go through each one of these and see that continuity and change. And as the previous slide talked about, you have this big picture. What's the big picture? How much did things change over time? And also the ripple effect. Did it go beyond, say, social changes? Did economics create social changes? Those types of things. Okay, let's go on to our next skill, which is periodization. This is another skill that's a little hard for people to wrap their heads around. So I like to think about periodization in the terms of what happened before and after an event, and what does this mean historically. So I provided an example down here. This is an actual example at the bottom of the page in the white box of periodization. And if we look at it, maybe we can make a little more sense of what periodization is all about. It says before the war, American militias were responsible for colonial safety. After the war, the safety of the colonists was in the hands of the oppressive British government and its troops. Okay, so before the war here, of course, we're talking about the French and Indian War. Okay, and then after the war, how it changed. So periodization is a before and after, and you need to try to stay on topic as best you can, not go too far before and too far after, to stay within the framework of the topic. Sometimes you can focus on differences, before and after, and sometimes similarities. Before and after, officials attempted to place taxes, and that would have different effects, of course. You could talk a little bit about that. All right, let's go forward. Skill 2, comparison and contextualization. Comparison, we just talked about a little bit. Comparison is one of those skills that we've been doing a long time. Tell us what is similar and different. And we just looked at an example of how that happens within periodization. So some of these skills overlap, and that's good news because it keeps us from basically missing a skill sometimes if we know they overlap with another one. Let's go on to contextualization, which is another really hard one. Contextualization is a skill that is all about what's going on nationally and what kind of trends can we see. So let's look at an example down at the bottom in the white box. This is off AP Central. Okay, so this says events, developments, processes can be explained as immediately relevant to the rise of new conservatism. That's our topic. We're talking about new conservatism from the late 1960s that develops into the 70s and the 80s. And here's some examples of how people contextualize this new conservative. It says reaction against perceived permissiveness of the 60s and 70s, including counterculture, anti-war protest, feminism, sexual revolution. And then also conservatism rises from Cold War, ongoing threat of anti-communism. Okay, so this is the ability to take a specific document, for instance. Let's say you have a piece of Richard Nixon's speech about the silent majority, that group of Americans that never really speaks up, that they silently have opinions and valid opinions about our nation and how our nation should function. However, they're not very vocal. They're not part of that protesting group that we see on the TV. And so he makes this speech about the silent majority. And within that speech, there's context. The context is that Nixon is wanting people to become more conservative in the way that they act toward the government, and to become more conservative in the ways that they act publicly, and become more conservative in their views and in their morals. So that would be a good example of how you contextualize one particular source. And in a sense, it's like you're asking yourself, what in the world is this about? What is this source all about? What is it telling us is going on in the big picture of American history? And so contextualization is another one of those skills that it overlaps. It overlaps with continuity and change. Remember how we talked about continuity and change as if we're talking about ripple effect and big picture? Well, contextualization does some of the same things. Let's go to skill 3. This is historical arguments. This is where we get in a little more of the writing skills. I'm not going to read these long explanations for you, but historical argumentation is how we form our written arguments and how we use our support. Using support is vital to the short answer, the long essay, and the document-based question. This is a big skill that they want to see you be able to do, to form an argument, support it with relevant, fully explained information. And then the next skill, appropriate use of that evidence. And I just touched on that you want to be able to use evidence that supports your argument, that's relevant, and that you can explain it fully. And we've been doing that a lot in history for a long time. This is a skill that students have less trouble with than some of the other difficult skills like periodization, contextualization. Now we're up to skill 4. This is interpretation. Interpretation you're going to see in short answers. You're going to see it in both of the essays. What does this mean and what is this about? You know, when you look at your short answer questions, and I have videos on interpretation and how you're going to be required to interpret what people say, to interpret political cartoons, tables, that type of thing. You're going to be asked and required to do that on the multiple choice test, and involve yourself in deciding what this means and what this is all about. So you might want to refer to those videos on the short answer questions, the ones that deal with interpretation, to get a little more in depth on that. Skill 4, synthesis. This is one students have a lot of questions about, and I have an example that I'm going to refer to. Synthesis is past and present. You know, how does the past influence, how is the future influenced by historical events? Here is an example down here from an essay. Connecting the argument to a development in a different time, situation, geographical area. The rise of new outlook in response to troubles of society similar to what happened during the Second Great Awakening. During that time, many religious people were unsatisfied with the way their society developed. In both periods, societal developments reinvigorated religious thinking and helped us return to past ideals. This passage comes from an essay that deals with the 1960s and the Civil Rights era. So the student is making a connection and saying that, hey, you know, in the United States we've been through this before. You know, we have these periods or these times when we have awakenings to injustice, and we have people who return to those initial ideals in the Declaration of Independence. All people are created equal, and they begin to try to make change. So that's what synthesis asks you to do, is to connect and say, did this happen before? Did it influence something in the future? And to write about that. And usually once students understand that skill, they are pretty comfortable with it. So I hope this short video helped you understand some of the harder skills, periodization, contextualization, synthesis, and also learn about how to write about those skills and how to use those skills on the test. In the long essay and the document-based question, you're going to be asked to use those skills a lot. And I like to make little acronyms sometimes to help students remember what skills you're going to be using as you write. And so I have C cubed is comparison, causation, contextualization for the C cubed, and the interpretation and support for is. These are the skills we're going to see a lot in short answer questions. So I will be referring to those as we go through our videos. The long essay, document-based questions, we're going to use periodization, argument, continuity, synthesis, and that makes a little word packs. So if that helps you remember some of the skills you're going to be able to touch upon in different parts of the test, I hope it does help you with that. And otherwise, I will see you in the next video on short answer questions and also the essays. Thanks for watching.